Welcome to the YouTube channel for the HR M&A Roundtable. I'm Dr. Klint Kendrick, chair of the HR M&A Roundtable and author of the HR Practitioner's Guide to Mergers and Acquisitions Due Diligence. The HR M&A Roundtable is a forum for practitioners teaching practitioners how people, leadership, and culture drive M&A deal value. We provide a variety of opportunities for HR M&A practitioners to connect with one another, including an annual conference, webinars, a Women in HR M&A mastermind group, and of course, roundtables. I started the HR M&A Roundtable because peer learning is an invaluable resource, especially if you're new to the HR M&A space. As an experienced practitioner and HR M&A leader at a Fortune 500 company, I continue to rely on the Roundtable to stay up to date with the latest trends and thinking in HR M&A. You can learn more about the HR M&A Roundtable by visiting www.mdaroundtable.com, where you can find information on our organization and the many resources we provide for HR M&A practitioners. While you're there, sign up for our mailing list so you can stay informed about our upcoming events. Okay, and without further ado, I'm going to take just a moment to introduce our panelists for today. So I'm really excited that we have three people with really deep expertise in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and understand how that plays into the world of mergers and acquisitions. So our panelists today are Zoe Bogan. Zoe's a corporate development M&A integration specialist, most recently with KPMG, and is about to start a new adventure, but like all things M&A, it's confidential until announced. So really excited to have Zoe here sharing her experience with us. Keith Mitchell is the founder of Holistic People Analytics, and he most recently came from a highly acquisitive tech company where he was responsible for ensuring that their OFCCP, EEOC, and other D&I types of compliance activities were managed appropriately. And then finally, we have Madeline Borkin, who is a vice president at the Institute for Corporate Productivity, or I4CP, and she's also the executive sponsor of their Chief Diversity Officer Board. So we're going to have some great conversation today from these three experts. And I'm just going to go ahead and get us started. So there's been a pretty meaningful shift in the way corporate America talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the past several years, with some significant acceleration in the last few months. So Madeline, could you give us an overview of the changing corporate landscape around DE&I?
Sure. Thank you, Clint. The corporate landscape has changed dramatically when it comes to DE&I. It's gone from basic requirements for DE&I where facades prevailed and there was no real commitment to very real actions and impact. As you know, in times of crisis, you can reveal the true character of an individual. This is also true of an organization and its leadership. With the pandemic, the slowdown of the global economy, the election, the murder of George Floyd, and the subsequent eruption of grief, outrage, frustration, it's gone way beyond the US, and it's a global reckoning about systemic racism and social injustice. And so it's had a wide array of effects on culture, politics, business, and in particular in the workplace. And so it's all testing the true character of organizations as well. And in this era of continuous disruption, an organization can literally go from relevant to irrelevant, as well as irrelevant to relevant overnight. And so it really does matter, aside from the recent SEC mandate, ISO standards, board requirements, employees, suppliers, partners, and customers, they're all demanding it. And in fact, shortly after the George Floyd murder, I think it was around June 5th, we conducted a survey where nearly 47% of the survey respondents said that they believe their organizations have an obligation to address the issue and take a stand. And then to that end, 68% have released an official statement internally to their workforces. And then a combined 26% released an official public statement from their CEO or other senior leader within 24 hours. But what is really concerning and frankly astonishing is that a combined 24% of those organizations did say that they have no plans to release a statement either internally or externally. So when you think about that and you just think about the impact that that all of the instances in our world in the last 6 months, 7 months have happened. I mean, silence is on critical social issues really leaves room for interpretation. And it's where organizations literally stand regarding their cultures and their values. And so it's not only about their employees, but more importantly about their customers and partners as well. But one of the things that as the corporate landscape is completely changing, and it's absolutely critical to respond, and DE&I is really at the forefront of that. And it started all with the pandemic. It's going to impact talent attraction and those customer relationships. When in one of the studies, we actually asked 500 respondents about, what are their perceptions, and 62% of respondents said that they would not work for an organization if they disagreed with their stated beliefs. And then 65% said that they wouldn't buy from a company if they disagreed with their stated values. I encourage everyone to go to different websites of where you buy things and or where you do business, and look at the CEO statements or the public statements and really understand what are the actions that those organizations are taking. VF Corporation, parent company of a number of different brands like North Face and Timberland and Vans, you could see individual CEO statements across each of the brands. It's pretty powerful, and it's meaningful to the employees as well as the customers.
Great. Thank you, Madeline. Keith, can you talk to us about some of the changes that are happening at the EEOC, OFCCP, or state government levels in the midst of everything else that's going on?
Sure. The most significant recent government action from a D&I perspective was President Trump's Executive Order 13950 that was signed in September 2020. The order is called Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping. The intent of the executive order is to eliminate or limit diversity training in both the government and for federal contractors. The order basically states that there's no institutional racism and no unbiased, unconscious bias within the country, and that forcing individuals to participate in training is a violation of their rights. With the anticipated change in administration, I assume this order will be rescinded. Another recent development with the current election cycle is that California has voted to reject Proposition 16. The proposition would have allowed public universities and government agencies to consider race, sex, ethnicity, or national origin in admissions or hiring decisions. Proposition 16 would have repealed the ban on affirmative action that was approved by California voters in 1996. I think the failure of Proposition 16 can be considered as a blow to the expansion of D&I efforts in the state. On a more positive note, ban-the-box laws and second chance programs that help ex-offenders find work will continue to expand. The ban-the-box laws remove the checkbox on job applications that ask ex-offenders if they have a criminal record. And we should note that it's estimated that about 70 million people have criminal records. As of February of this year, 35 states and more than 150 cities and counties have ban-the-box laws, which is a very positive sign. Just in 2009, the states of Colorado and New Mexico enabled the ban-the-box laws. So again, a very, very positive sign. Relative to current employment actions, generally speaking, the current administration loosened Department of Labor and OFCCP regulations, but I anticipate that the new administration will both restore and vigorously enforce the EEO laws and all compliance regulations. The teams involved in M&A deals really should take into consideration current long-standing EEOC and OFCCP employment laws and affirmative action requirements, and really verify that both companies in the deal are in compliance. Lastly, the growing social awareness of stakeholders and customers have really put the spotlight on economic equity for females and for minority employees. However, we really should make sure that with this increased demand and increased transparency in the area of salary disclosure, we must consider current privacy laws and regulations at both the federal and the state levels.
Well, there's definitely a lot going on there. So we have a corporate perspective. We know what's going on in the compliance world. Zoe, maybe you can help us to understand how we see this affecting deal making and some of the trends that are happening in the M&A space.
Sure. So I think I like to say that we always get a shift every few years, and HR professionals will understand this. So about, let's just say 10 years ago, maybe HR was not at the due diligence table. Now that is a prerequisite, right? So remember how that felt. And then we were talking about culture, how that was really important. And now we are speaking about DE&I, which is just as relevant. And so we do see a lot of corporations talking a little bit more about D&I now. Are all created equally in terms of the value they're giving to the M&A deal? Not necessarily. There's still work to be done there, but M&A professionals can still work to kind of answer key questions to pull back the laters. And here's a few things that I mean. So when you're kind of looking at a deal, you want to understand the reporting structure. So a chief diversity officer reporting into the CEO as opposed to HR, you get a totally different organization. Many organizations now are paying their business resource groups. Wow, that's saying that, you know what, not only do we care about diversity, we're gonna put some dollars behind it. And here's how we're showing up. How many D&I resources are allotted to the chief diversity officer? Are they a one-person show, or do they actually have people behind them to get the job done? How does it work in terms of marketplace, and how big is their budget? So these all encompass how M&A professionals should kind of like look at a deal. We do have some work to be done. The same way when we started with like HR in the deal process and culture, there's work to be done there. But I am happy now at least many organizations are starting the conversation, but throughout the deal process, we have to push them a little bit further to kind of get the end result we want.
Okay, I think I was just talking to my mute. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Zoe. So we know that very few M&A transactions are stopped due to HR issues. And, for now, I'm including D&I in that, though, as we'll discuss, we know that D&I goes way beyond HR. But since we know that they're not likely to stop a deal, why is it important for us to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion during due diligence and integration planning if they really aren't going to affect the outcome of the transaction? Keith, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I believe that there's a direct cause and effect relationship between D&I initiatives and improved recruitment of high caliber talent. The short and long-term success of a deal can be impacted by D&I initiatives that help reduce the attrition of high performers as well. In many cases, the value of a deal is dependent on the human capital that is brought to the table. From a risk management perspective, it's important to identify and understand where the risk and liabilities lie. From a reputation and brand management standpoint, companies invest significant financial resources into maintaining and building their market share. And it doesn't take much to damage or destroy company's image in the public or on social media. I would say two recent examples illustrate the impact of social media. First, the support for and the opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement has really caused some tension within the work environment. A second example would be the CEO of Wells Fargo was quoted as saying, while it might sound like an excuse, the unfortunate reality is that there's a very limited pool of Black talent to recruit from. What impact do you think the CEO statement will have on the company's brand, its culture, and particularly their Black employee sense of belonging? These are very important factors. It's important to keep in mind that social media is a powerful communication tool. The CEO statement has been widely circulated and widely criticized. I think that a leader that is that far out of touch, it says a lot about the culture of the company itself. So again, social media has to be taken into consideration.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Keith. Zoe, how about your thoughts?
So I'm a firm believer. Many organizations, as I started to say, are speaking about diversity and inclusion, which is great, but it needs to change from a discussion to action to really peel back those layers. And here's what I'm talking about. So at the leadership level, everyone, most companies, organizations are a fan of diversity. However, sometimes the change takes place in middle management, and you want to make sure that middle management is aligned with the practices and values of what the firm is saying. So you can take various professions, right? So you look at legal, you look at accounting specifically. There's about 1% African-American partners. Now, firms are very much behind diversity, but what is occurring for that number to still be so low in 2020? You need to take a look at that. Also, you really need to pay attention from an action standpoint. If you're looking at two organizations where the leadership level of maybe African Americans or Latino is 10% and one maybe 1%, you want to understand what change is occurring so you can kind of action that. So I think the discussion is great, but I think it needs to go from a discussion to action. And it can also work vice versa. So you can have I remember a smaller deal, and they didn't have a D&I plan or an action plan. And so they kind of learned from the larger corporation, oh, well, how should we think about this in terms of recruiting more women and hiring more women? How should we think about diverse population and communication? So it can kind of work both ways, but to really impact change in M&A, it needs to go from a discussion to a detailed action plan. And we need to kind of dig through those layers to kind of understand what's going to get us the real deal value and impact change.
Great, thanks, Zoe. Madeline, how about your thoughts?
Yeah, if companies that have more diverse management teams have 19% higher revenue due to innovation, and that's according to a BCG study. And if culture is the #1 reason most acquisitions succeed or fail, and inclusion is a key component of a strong culture, we have to ask ourselves, why not? Why isn't it a part of the process? According to I4CP's M&A study we unveiled at the latter part of 2019, high performance organizations are 11 times more likely to place a very high priority on cultural synergies than their low performing counterparts. And we went on to ask a question around, in which of the following ways does your organization typically measure M&A effectiveness? And so when we asked, and we gave them a list of different ways and of measurements, and high performance organizations are 4.5 times more likely to consider gains in workforce diversity figures against stated objectives post-acquisition as a measure of M&A effectiveness. And so, with the SEC mandate, ISO standards, investors, boards, they're all asking for the culture and the diversity and inclusion in ESG measures. There's really no better time right now to understand what are those levers that we could pull, or leading indicators of the people component of the business that could have the greatest impact on the business outcomes. One example is we interviewed Caroline Mandeville, the CHRO, former a subsidiary of TIAA. And what she said was, one of the most important indicators of an acquisition success is the retention of assets, retention of clients, customers, and accounts. But I think if you're doing all the right things with respect to integration, and especially if the goal of an acquisition is to grow your business in some way, you want to be able to retain talent. I think those are the leading indicators as to whether the acquisition is actually effective. And so to her point, Caroline's point, while some financial metrics may take years to realize, there are those short-term indicators that are important for all of us to monitor. And so it'll play a critical role in that due diligence. And often, identifying those leading indicators of financial success or failure. So the top non-financial measures that organizations should really be thinking about is, and I think both Zoe and Keith said this, is retention of critical talent in the acquired company, retention of talent in the acquiring company, increases in workforce productivity, and gains in employee engagement scores and employee sentiment. Again, a key component is going to be that inclusion and diversity piece. Do I feel like I belong? Am I safe here? And then gains in workforce diversity. Multiple markers, and I can go on, but one thing that I do want to call out is, according to the law firm, Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Felds, their annual look on top board issues, corporate reputation, pay equity, board diversity, ESG, all rank in the top 10 of topics. And one other thing that one of my favorite people is Jamie Gorlick. She's a partner at the law firm Wilmer Hale and a member of the board at Amazon and VeriSign. And, she echoes the sentiment when I4CP asks for her perspective on increased emphasis of boards on placing corporate culture. This is my clients' corporate boards. They want to know if they are sitting on quicksand. And then she goes on to say, they want to know how well their companies are run and what the spirit of people in the company is. This actually surfaced during the Me Too movement, when many board members said to themselves, I had no idea that was the kind of community that we were supposedly overseeing. That's powerful.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider right now. And so if I can summarize, Madeline and Keith and Zoe, you've shared that it really makes a difference for the customers, brand reputation, for the employees, for the boards, and now for the regulators. So we know that DE&I issues are becoming more and more front and center, and they will affect our due diligence and integration planning. So let's get a little more tactical, and let's go ahead and talk about some of the ways that you can focus on DE&I during the diligence process. Zoe, why don't we start with you?
Awesome. So we started out discussing D&I in terms of people, and I want to challenge all the attendees today. As you think about D&I, if you think about it just as a people exercise, you are missing out on a whole component of D&I. And I'll just go through a few things that all M&A professionals should really pay attention to. So to start off, D&I should be a part of the go-to-market plan. There is opportunity with diverse clients. People need to think about it. You need to challenge business leaders to think about how it helps the clients and the firm. I'll give you an example. So the Wall Street Journal just published an article, and there's a law firm and accounting firm getting together to invest and build up Black banks across the country. Now, that was a discussion that would not have happened 10 years ago, but you're starting to see kind of different opportunities in D&I for go-to-market and market development. Another example was there was an African-American food service entrepreneur who wanted to acquire another company. He was really specific and intentional about wanting a diverse team, right? So that kind of is an opportunity for D&I. You also look at COOs, CFOs, CEOs around the country that are Black and Latino. You're missing out on opportunities. And so I think that in each go-to-market plan, there needs to be a specific section to say, what is our D&I plan? Because that is something that should be taken seriously, and it's not just about the people. So to move on from that, procurement is also another major factor. Most organizations now have supplier diversity segments, which is in procurement. Again, we're not talking about people, it's another area, but they're looking at this stuff. How are you advancing entrepreneurs? Do you have a program in place? What is your organization saying and doing about this? That is really important. Another aspect is legal, right? In each legal department, there are some aspects of the work that is outsourced. Well, how much of the work is outsourced to diverse law firms? That is D&I, right? Because it's all equitable. And then lastly, and of course, but not least, you have the people aspect, which is really always very important. Madeline and Keith both discussed the importance of the assets. And if you don't have people, it is hard to keep a corporation going. Also, many people now, employees, want to understand how companies are thinking about D&I, how they're giving back, that they're taking it serious. So that's always really important. But if you kind of take away anything from this segment and what I'm saying, D&I as a people exercise, it encompasses much more. It is impacting revenue in ways it has not in the past, and that should be addressed in every deal.
Great, thanks, Zoe. Madeline, how about your thoughts on some ways to focus on DE&I during diligence?
Two practices that I'd like to call out is bias audit checklists, and really looking at HR practices and processes and really understanding where the bias audit might be in talent acquisition, let's say, or performance management. My favorite example is really around succession management and just looking at the processes within succession. I mean, diversity at the entry level and supervisor ranks, it's become less of a challenge, I would say. But there are significant gaps when you get to the manager, director, and VP levels and above. And many organizations are really continuing to struggle with not only finding talent, but also developing the diverse candidates for senior leadership roles. We conducted a pulse survey, or I think it was in August, and asked for any further changes that organizations might deploy in succession, in their succession processes, in response to action to the inequities among underrepresented groups. And 38% of organizations said that they are and they're in the midst of a transformation, right? And looking at their succession. It's absolutely critical. For 2020, it was a key priority. But now another 38% are saying that they're going to go even further and alter it to a moderate and greater extent, which is really, really telling. And so bias audit checklists, I highly recommend. Look at all the HR processes. Holding leaders accountable is another key component of looking at once you've determined and conducted the audit of the processes, and I have some checklists that I can share with you. It's then ensuring that you're creating accountability and recognizing and rewarding leaders to take this and other actions to promote diversity and inclusion in the process. The other practice that I love, and I know that you're going to have Rob Cross, but one of my all-time favorite people. I'm a huge fan of Rob Cross. He is the pioneer of organizational network analysis, and conducting an organizational network analysis where you can identify some of those key influencers within a target company can really help and help you through that assimilation process when you're purchasing a company. And so you can identify those influencers, and then they can serve as ambassadors for you. So while less than a quarter of companies or high performance organizations currently perform this type of an analysis, I4CP is identifying O&A as a next practice. And I'm sure Rob is going to share all of the details of what that looks like, but it's really, really neat and has a huge, huge impact to the bottom line in a number of different ways.
Great, thank you. And for those of you who are really excited about talking about organizational network analysis, that's going to be at our February 9th meeting where Rob Cross is going to join us. But yeah, thank you for sharing that, Madeline. Keith, how about you? Some of the best practices for focusing on DE&I during due diligence.
Well, I think part of identifying potential D&I issues and risks within the culture is to analyze indicators such as internal EEO complaints and formal discrimination charges. Although these are typically part of the legal related reviews, they also provide insight into potential cultural conflicts within the organization. I personally like to look at and review compensation and performance review practices. And they can provide insight into any potential history of bias within the organization. These are also potential areas of risk, such as class action lawsuits. I would also recommend focusing on completing a gap analysis to determine the differences and similarities in the D&I cultures between the two companies. I think two important aspects of this are, one, what degree of leadership buy-in have the companies achieved to date? And two, are D&I goals established and tied to management financial rewards? In addition, it's important to recognize that there could be more than one culture within an organization. The culture that is defined by the company's leadership, external stakeholders, and majority employees may not be the culture that's perceived by the organization's female and minority employees. And this applies to both of the organizations who are pursuing the deal. Lastly, there are many companies who have won awards and recognition for their D&I accomplishments. However, what I found, if you ask their minority employees or female employees about the company culture or work environment, they may have a different perspective on the company's progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that, Keith. So we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of different thoughts. If you had one key takeaway for our audience, what would it be? Madeline, why don't we go ahead and start with you? Oh, Madeline, we've got you on mute.
I want to go back to what I said before, how quickly you could become, you can go from relevant to irrelevant. And I think, and from irrelevant to relevant literally overnight. I just continue to think about, that 65% of respondents from the I4CP survey said that they wouldn't buy from a company that they disagreed with, and D&I shows up there. And then the second part of that is another, 62% also said that they would not work for an organization, who disagreed with their beliefs. And so at the end of the day, it's going to hit the bottom line. I think about, I had Namrata Yadav, who is the Vice President and Chief Strategist for Bank of America on inclusion metrics. And she met with our Chief Diversity Officer board and shared some of the things around how they hold leaders accountable. But the one thing that she said is Brian Moynihan, the CEO of B of A, he asks literally on a daily basis or anytime he bumps into her, he says, what more should we do? And, what action is expected? And she went on to say that The focus has always been around tactics and insight. So like, where's the opportunity? Looking at overall representation of race, gender, lines of business benchmarks, what are we trying to achieve? And always, framing the op-ed around D&I as a business. It's the business and it's about everyone. And so diversity strategies are really seen as a business strategy within organizations that are high performing. And it's really about the employees, partners, clients, and communities. At the end of the day, you're going to impact the bottom line very dramatically, and especially in the short term with your line of sight. In the long term, these are great leading indicators, is to really track that and to look at those data points in the process of acquisition.
Great. Thanks, Madeline. Keith, how about you? If you had one key takeaway for the folks here today, what would it be?
It's difficult to bring it down to one key point, but I would have to put my compliance hat on and say that M&A teams need to be aware of both the documented policies and unwritten practices of both organizations, and how the unwritten practices impact both the culture and employee perceptions of their D&I initiatives, as well as the overall environment of the company.
Great, thanks, Keith. And how about for you, Zoe? What would your one key takeaway be?
Okay, to close out, one, I want M&A teams to be empowered to voice their concerns about D&I, and there are HR professionals here. Remember, a few years ago, it wasn't easy to get that seat at the table with HR and during due diligence. It wasn't easy for culture. It's not going to be totally easy for diversity, but it's a necessary conversation. One aspect that I also want to highlight is reframing D&I just about people. It's all encompassing. It impacts revenue. It impacts legal and procurement. So bring those strategies to the table. And lastly, I want to say I'm excited about a part 2 of this conversation, because I don't think it can end just with this. So those are my takeaways.
Great, thanks, Zoe. So we're going to open it up for Q&A from folks who are in attendance today. If you have a question for our panel, please go ahead and put that into the chat. And while you're gathering your thoughts, you can either put them in the public chat, by the way, or message them directly to me, and we'll go ahead and get those asked. I am curious. One of the things that I've seen happening more and more in deals is a proliferation of representations around Me Too. Basically, as part of the agreement, the company is saying, hey, we haven't had any significant sexual harassment, and I'm seeing those start to extend into other types of discrimination. But in addition to changes to the reps and warranties, how do you recommend that companies protect themselves when a target isn't going to disclose bad behavior or doesn't know about it? So some thoughts about that? Whoever'd like to go first?
Well, I think that one area to look at is any charges or complaints that are raised through the court system or EEOC or OFCCP. Again, there's a lot of public information out there that if you don't get it directly from the company, you can get it from public sources.
Yeah,
absolutely. And one conversation we were having a little earlier is that the deal process moves very quickly. So Keith made a phenomenal recommendation. So M&A professionals, do not allow them to say, we don't have time to check that. Make sure that you do the due diligence and stand firm in that and do the work there. So.
Great. Well, and we actually got a question in the chat that dovetails quite nicely into that. So are there any specific indicators we should look for as practitioners exploring the D&I space? So some examples are being if a company doesn't file their EEO-1s or don't have an affirmative action program in place. And for those who don't know, an EEO-1 is a required filing that breaks the workforce by race and gender into different categories. So that's a required filing. And then some are required to have an affirmative action program in place. So if those are missing, are those indicators as there's an issue? Are there other indicators that we should be looking for?
I think that would be to me, that would be the initial review. Again, sometimes it's performed by legal, but I think every team involved in the process should check those boxes off. And that's a really good indicator as far as is the management of the company doing the basic fundamentals of their responsibility in this area.
Right, absolutely. And I would also say you have your firm processes that Keith outline, but then you have the soft processes, right? So it's important for D&I and other professionals to understand what's not being said. So at the start of this, I said that if the chief diversity officer reports into the CEO as opposed to HR, you get a totally different organization. You want to look and see how many resources are allotted to D&I. That gives you a lot of insight into the organization. So while they may be following protocols legally, these other areas also highlight the advancement of where companies are in terms of D&I, and you really want to pay attention to that.
Great. So one thing that I'm kind of curious about is if you look at different industries, you know, we've had a lot of conversation about the American business climate in general, and obviously that's affecting some other parts of the world. But if we break it down a little further and look at industry by industry, do you think there's a difference in an industry that's more people heavy? You know, like I'm thinking professional services or a technology company where it tends to be a different type of workforce and customer base than a company that you know, is making heavy equipment or you know, doing other types of work. So do you think that industry matters when doing diligence?
I think from a D&I standpoint, it matters to some extent as far as your sourcing. Again, the heavy labor intensive industries will be doing more local sourcing of labor versus a technology company that will do more global sourcing, a lot more offshoring as well.
Yeah, and the way I think about it is across all industries, when you're looking at the D&I strategy of the organization, at the end of the day, it's about the workforce, workplace, and the marketplace. And then, as you know, Keith mentioned, sure, sourcing could be different in an organization, let's say as for transportation where you need somebody local versus high-tech organization that might be able to hire, you know, outside or anywhere in the world for certain roles. I also recommend, you know, being disruptive and really just thinking outside the box of where jobs could be, what, you know, how organizations could really be thinking about D&I strategies or practices that could make an impact within their organizations. And what I see day in and day out is different industries working together on D&I practices that are going to make an impact to the bottom line. I will see high-tech companies with retail organizations, with major manufacturing organizations working together to design practices. And in fact, the bias audit, you know, checklist that I mentioned earlier around talent acquisition and succession planning and performance management and beyond, those were all created by a variety of industries in support of this type of research and in support of D&I.
And I would just add really quickly, I think no matter what industry, the bones have to be there as a foundation, and you can't really like falter with those in terms of metrics, accountability, implementation. Sometimes how you go about it may differ. For instance, an ad agency is going to be totally different in terms of inventing things in a law firm, but the bones have to be there for any organization to kind of have real results.
Very, very good point. I think one final thought I would put forth is that company leadership has to be the champion of any initiative. It will not work no matter what your industry or what strategy you have if the leadership is not behind it. they've got not only support, but they've got to be the champions.
So I'm being asked if there are any examples of companies that are doing this well. I know this is a really emerging area, but if you look across the landscape and could point to a company or two that seems to really have their arms wrapped around this, who would those companies be?
One company that comes to mind to me that has been in the forefront for many, many years is Sodexo. I've admired that company for many years as far as they're being take their initiatives they've taken, and they're reporting through their annual reports on here's what we're doing.
Yeah. Any others?
Some that I mentioned Bank of America earlier. I would say Nike is another organization that's standing behind their actions and doing it really, really well, and understanding what in their processes they need to change and modify. I also mentioned VF Corporation earlier. They're doing just a fantastic job in really deploying their strategies and across all of their brands, which is really interesting, but still maintaining the individual uniqueness of those brands. Patagonia is another organization that's just, rock star status in terms of what they are doing in DE&I. I mentioned earlier Rob Cross's O&A, but Booz Allen Hamilton actually leverages the process or the practice of O&A during acquisitions. And Booz Allen Hamilton, Concilio is another organization. Natalie Stute, that used to be the CHRO there, was involved in every single acquisition. And as many of you may know, Concilio just has had dozens over the past few years. I would look at it, at some of the things that Natalie Stute has done at Concilio as well.
Great, thank you.
Just to circle back to Nike really quick, Nike had an interesting program with female athletes that were leaving the WNBA, and they were working on getting them into management, and they gave them training. And so when they hired them, they increased diversity by 50%, but they were really intentional about that. So it worked for Nike, it worked for the female athletes, it worked for diversity and inclusion, and I really like that program, and I'm looking forward to seeing it grow more. So Nike did some great work there.